We are in Isaiah chapter 34. This chapter, and actually the next chapter, chapter 35, form a unit in which the judgment of God is coming upon his enemies. These are some of the severest type of, as far as imagery is concerned, aspects of judgment. In the first 4 verses of chapter 34, there's a warning to those who hate God's way. And then in verses 5 through 7, which we started with verse 5 last time, God's sword is used to judge Edom, or the Edomites. And he says in verse 5, "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea and upon the people of my curse to judgment." So Edom is simply one of those who hate God's way. They are the descendants of Esau. And as we would see in Ezekiel chapter 35, they are a perpetual enemy of Israel. When it mentions the sword here, my sword, it includes, or would include, anything from a sword of war to a knife, any cutting instrument. Here it probably has reference to, or is used for, a knife that would be used in sacrificing animals to God. God is the one who is appearing, and he's the one who's using that knife or that sword. He's about to sacrifice Edom, and they are simply victims for his slaughter. I think we mentioned last week also that Idumea is Edom. It is called both in the scriptures, so I've been using Edom tonight. Don't be confused. That's also Idumea. When he says that my sword shall be bathed in heaven, the word bathed is from a Hebrew word meaning, according to Gesenius, who is a Hebrew lexicon, or has a Hebrew lexicon, means to drink largely, to be satisfied with drink. The Hebrew Aramaic lexicon defines the word to water abundantly, and then goes on to be watered, and then says to drink one's fill, become drunk. So that presents a little bit different picture than the idea of bathed, that God says, my sword shall be watered abundantly in heaven. He's going to drink largely, or be satisfied with drink. But it's in relationship to a sacrifice that is made of the Edomites, and thus the blood that is shed by them that is being referred to here, using that in the King James, bathed in heaven, or he's going to drink largely from their blood, basically. I think just look at this real quick. I can get over there. My sword, the American Standard, shall drink its fill in heaven. That's the way the American Standard translates it. And that's a pretty accurate way in which you look at the Hebrew word. My sword hath drunk its fill in heaven. Thus, God's wrath is coming down upon Edom to execute vengeance upon them. And his sword is going to be filled with the blood of their sacrifice. If someone turns over to Deuteronomy 32 and read verses 41 and 42 of Deuteronomy 32. Sounds very similar, doesn't it, as to what Isaiah is saying. He might very well be taking the imagery that Moses set forth here in Deuteronomy and using it in regards to Edom or Idumea. To give you an idea, pulpit commentaries put forth a little bit of history of the Edomites with Israel. And this kind of gives you an insight as to the animosity that was there. But they wrote, the Edomites first showed themselves enemies of Israel when they refused to allow the Israelites under Moses a passage through their border, Numbers 20, verses 14 through 21. David subdued them, 2 Samuel 8:14, but they revolted from Jehoram in 2 Chronicles 21, verses 8 through 11, and were thenceforward among the most bitter adversaries of the southern kingdom. They smote Judah in the reign of Ahaz, 2 Chronicles 28:17. Jehoram was one of the kings of Judah, yes. Let's see. They smote Judah in the reign of Ahaz, 2 Chronicles 28:17. And were always ready to, quote, shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of their calamity, is what Ezekiel 35:5 says. Amos speaks of them very much in the same tone as Amos chapter 1, verses 11 and verse 12. They ultimately fill up the measure of their iniquity by open rejoicing when Jerusalem was destroyed, and the people led away captive by Nebuchadnezzar. Psalm 137:7, Obadiah verses 10 through 14, Lamentations 4:21, 22, and Ezekiel 35:10 through 13. In the present passage, we must regard the Edomites as representative of the enemies of God's people generally. But you can see from almost the start of the Israelite nation, as far as going into the land of Palestine, they asked the Edomites, can we pass through your land? We won't disturb anything. If we get water or food, we'll pay for it. And the Edomites came out to fight them and said, no, you cannot pass through. And from that time forward, they were enemies. And then, as pulpit commentary puts it, they filled up the measure of their iniquities. When Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, they were there cheering for Nebuchadnezzar, destroy them. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar started taking away captives from Jerusalem, and they were cheering and helping Nebuchadnezzar. That's the hatred that the Edomites had for the Israelites. Now then, as pulpit commentary puts it, and I agree that in this passage, the Edomites are representative of any of God's enemies. But here with the Edomites, you see an intense hatred for the Israelites, and thus for God. Anytime you do something to the people of God, you're doing it to him. Saul learned that. Saul of Tarsus learned that. Remember when he was on the road to Damascus, and the bright light appears to him, and Jesus asked him, "Why do you persecute me?" And his response was to be in submission to Jesus. But Jesus' question, "Why are you persecuting me?" Saul was only persecuting Christians. And so we learn that important lesson. What you do to Christians, you're doing to Christ. How you treat Christians, how you're treating Christ. Now then, that really should be no surprise, because Christ is referred to as the head of the what? The body. In the figure that we're using, head and body. If somebody does something to your body, are they doing it to you, the head, as well? Or if they do something to the head, aren't they doing it to your body as well? You can't separate the head from the body. Neither can you separate Christ from the church. And so whatever you do to the church, you're doing to Christ. Well, going back into the Old Testament figure now, since it is representative, you have a typology type situation, what a nation did to Israel, they were doing to God. Because Israel was God's chosen people. And so he was going to be their God, and they would be his people. Today, that's the church, but then it was Israel. So whatever you did to them, you were doing to God. The Edomites had a hatred for the people of God, thus they had a hatred for God. They tried to destroy the people of God. Rejoiced when evil happened to them. And so God is using a very vivid picture that he's going to come and he's going to, his sword is going to be filled with their blood and their vengeance upon them because of how they treated the Israelites. God had placed a curse on the Edomites. And that was, again, because of their hatred of Israel. But the curse goes all the way back to Genesis 25th chapter. Somebody turn over to Genesis 23 and read verse 20, or Genesis 25 and read verse 23. Start turning those numbers around. Genesis 25:23. Okay. Esau was the elder, but he was going to be servant. Go a few chapters over to chapter 27. And he's talking now about Esau and his descendants when you come down to verse 40. And what are we told? Okay. By thy sword thou shalt live. That was a description of the Edomites. They were to be a possession for Judah. We would see in Numbers 24 and verse 18 where it states, uses that phrase, and Edom shall be a possession. Seir also shall be a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Here's Israel doing valiantly, as opposed to the Edomites being a possession. That conjures up the imagery of that the Edomites were basically slaves. They belonged to others, and specifically to Israel. Okay, Dale.
Jesus told Peter, put your sword back up in the sheath, for all that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Not there before he got put on the cross.
I'm not sure how that applies to this, though, because God also instructed us to to get a sword. He commanded the Israelites to use the sword. So I'm not sure how that applies to this situation. The Amos, and pulpit commentary mentioned Amos 1, verses 11 and verse 12. And that is, Amos is setting forth their punishment when he says, thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. But I will send a fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Bozrah. So Teman and Bozrah were cities of Edom. And God is saying, for 3 sins and yet for 4, I will not turn away the punishment from them. In other words, God was going to take vengeance upon them. And then he lists 4 sins, which would be some good lessons in regards to that. Pursued his brother with the sword. That's not a good way to treat someone who historically is your brother. Pursuing them with the sword. Cast off all pity. That goes back to that very attitude that when Nebuchadnezzar's destroying Jerusalem, they're cheering. Yay, they're being destroyed. No pity whatsoever. in relationship to Edom in regards to Israel. His anger did tear perpetually, always from the very beginning to the end, always mad at Israel. Kept his wrath forever. So God was going to send a fire and devour them. And that's basically what we're seeing here in verse 5. In verse 6, he goes on, the sword of the Lord is filled with blood and is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of lambs and goats, and with the fat of the kidneys of rams. And the Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah. There's that city Bozrah again that Amos mentions. But in this verse, he is basically continuing that idea of a sacrifice. And the Lord's sword, or knife, being used in that sacrifice, and is filled or is glutted with blood. When he talks about it is made fat with fatness, if you turn over to Leviticus, the 3rd chapter, and starting in verse 3 and going through verse 15, he says, and he shall offer the sacrifice of the peace offering unto an offering made by fire unto the Lord. Now he mentions it is the peace offering. The fat that covereth the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver, and the kidneys, it shall he take away. And Aaron's son shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is upon the wood that is on the fire. It is an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. And if his offering be a sacrifice of peace offering unto the Lord of the flock. So this is a peace offering now. Male or female, he shall offer it without blemish. If he offer a lamb of his offering, then he shall offer it before the Lord. And he shall lay his hand upon the head of the offering and kill it before the tabernacle of the congregation. And Aaron's son shall sprinkle the blood thereof round about upon the altar. And he shall offer the sacrifice of the peace offering, an offering made by fire unto the Lord, the fat thereof, and the whole rump. And it shall he take off hard by the backbone, and the fat that covereth the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is upon them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver, and with the kidneys it shall he take away. And the priest shall burn it upon the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire unto the Lord. And if his offering be a goat, then he shall offer it before the Lord, and he shall lay his hand upon the head of it, and kill it before the tabernacle of the congregation, and the son of Aaron shall sprinkle the blood thereof upon the altar round about. He shall offer thereof his offering, even an offering made by fire unto the Lord, the fat that covereth the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is upon them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver, with the kidneys, it shall he take away. Later on in Leviticus chapter 7 and verse 3, he says, and he shall offer it all the fat thereof, the rump and the fat that covereth the inwards. You can see the emphasis upon the fat there. So it is made with fatness is a very accurate statement in relationship to the sacrifices which Israel had to offer. And so he's using that imagery of a sacrifice, except God is the one who is the one doing the sacrificing of Edom in this case. The fat of sacrifices that you read about in Leviticus specifically deals also with the sacrifice made for sin. The fat and the blood refer to the animal substance offered in sacrifice. The fat and the blood of lambs and goats, which were normally the animals offered by the Jews in sacrifice to God, but here it denotes the Edomites and their slaughter. But it would also include the Edomites of all classes. So it wouldn't matter whether you're talking about an upper class or lower class person. Doesn't make any difference. They're all being offered as a sacrifice, and their blood is being shed. The fat offered so with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. The kidneys also we would see in Leviticus 9 and verse 10, and that which we read earlier in Leviticus chapter 3. But in Leviticus 9 and verse 10, but the fat and the kidneys and the caul above the liver of the sin offering he burned upon the altar as the Lord commanded Moses. So the kidneys, again, would be offered to God in sacrifice. So with the fat of the kidneys of ram. Bozrah, we mentioned it. The Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah. Was one of the principal cities of Idumea or Edom. It was a city that was strongly fortified, and they thought thus it was impregnable, could not be defeated. Didn't matter who it was. Again, the pulpit commentary states that about this Bozrah, it is to be distinguished from the Bozrah of Moab, which was known to the Romans as Bostra. It lay in the hill country of the southeast of the Dead Sea, about 35 miles north of Petra, and was one of the earliest settlements of the descendants of Esau, being mentioned as a well-known place in Genesis chapter 36 and verse 33. So, well-fortified city that is one of the earliest of Moabs. Bozrah, along with the entire land. There's a slaughter over the entire land, including Bozrah. Fills the entire land. Jeremiah repeats this warning. If you look at Jeremiah chapter 49 and verse 13, for I have a sword by myself, saith the Lord, that Bozrah shall become a desolation, a reproach, a waste, and a curse, and all the cities thereof shall be perpetual waste. Just think of this city, a strong, well-fortified city that was the oldest, about the oldest of that nation. And now then, Isaiah is using this figure. They're going to be slaughtered as an animal sacrifice to God. And Jeremiah then adding their reproach, a curse, a waste, a desolation. If someone said that, let's just say about Pensacola, we might kind of roll our eyes, wouldn't we? and say, "You got to be kidding me." That's just crazy to think something like that. Now then, you can kind of imagine the Edomites' response to these warnings that God is giving. That this is an old city, nobody has been able to destroy it, we're still in existence. That's just not going to happen. Dale?
Is that one of the, that skinny, tall cliff where it was hard to get into, like a rock in a hard place getting through there? Was that inside that canal, or was it another spot?
I cannot say for certain in relationship to that city specifically. There were a lot of cities that were like that in Edom, where they just, nation couldn't get to them. Other nations could not get to them because of the cliffs of the rocks and such. And so they thought they were untouchable.
What they end up doing, starving them out, or they have tall siege mounds, or what? I forgot what happened. I used to.
I don't really remember what exactly happened or how they accomplished it. But I will say it was God's doing. So however it came about, and with whatever specific nation that did it, it was God who did it. As seen here, He is sacrificing them, or He's using them as a sacrifice to Him because of their hatred for God's people, His people. In verse 7 then, "And the unicorns shall come down unto them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness." This really is just continuing the figure that we have seen in the previous verses. An offering of a bloody sacrifice. Unicorns. I thought those were mythical animals. Weren't real.
What were they, like a pie guard? What were they?
American Standard New King James use the word wild oxen. Yeah. But in reality, while it's often mentioned, no one really knows what the animal is. If you go back into the Old Testament and you read of locusts, the locusts, today we call those grasshoppers. But we have what would be referred to as locusts, or what we call locusts. It's not the locusts of the Bible. The point that I'm making, things change names, for one thing. And simply because an animal is described and given a name in the Old Testament doesn't mean that's what we call it today. We might not know what it is. We don't with this animal, unicorn, wild oxen, or whatever it was. We can find some descriptions of it, and we can try and compare them to animals of today. This unicorn or wild oxen was presented as an animal of great strength. There's some individuals who think the rhinoceros is what it is describing. Rhinoceros is an animal of great strength. So what I'm getting at is we don't know, number one. When people try and guess, they come to different conclusions on it as to what it might be. Mm-hmm. A rhino is a good guess. Wild oxen is a good guess. Might be some other animal. So we don't really know. It's simply being used here to show the sacrifice would include the strong and the mighty. The great men of Edom, the leaders of Edom, the warriors, the strongest among the people. And then coming down to the general populace, just the common person. The bullocks with the bulls would basically represent both the young and the old. So it doesn't matter as far as age is concerned, they're both being included in this. So all ages, all classes of people would have their blood sacrificed by the sword or the knife of Yahweh. In Ezekiel 35 and verse 6, it says, "Therefore as I live, saith the Lord God, I will prepare thee unto blood, and blood shall pursue thee. Sith thou hast not hated blood, even blood shall pursue thee." That is a good description of what happens to Edom. It is an all-embracing, widespread slaughter of the Moabites. Young, in his commentary, summarizes this, and I think it's a good summary that we can mention a little bit more, but he says, sacrifice was the worship of the Lord. And whereas in itself the sight of slaughter was revolting, nevertheless in the sacrifice the God of Israel was honored and glorified. So it will be even in the judgment. The sword will fall in equity and justice, for none can say that justice is lacking. And inasmuch as this judgment is here pictured in terms of sacrifice, God will be glorified even in the punishment of the wicked. Even in the judgment of vengeance to come upon the reprobate, the honor of God will shine forth brightly. He who really takes offense at what is here related has no true conception of the heinous character of sinful rebellion against the Holy One of Israel. And I thought that last statement was really a powerful statement, that one who takes offense at what is being presented, a slaughter of the Moabites, that they really have no true conception of the heinous character of sin.
Look how devoted they were at Hitler and Mussolini, but they can't, make a comparison.
Well, yeah, they were, the heinous character of their sin caused those who saw the death camps, for example, to be just revolting. But when primarily used by atheists, the idea of God is not just. Because how can a just God send someone to an eternal punishment? How can a just God do that? A punishment that will be throughout eternity, never ending. Well, the problem is they do not realize the heinous nature of sin, how obnoxious, offensive it is to God. They don't think sin's all that bad in reality. And plus, you can look at it from the standpoint that they don't consider the nature of what sin cost. It cost the death of the only begotten Son of God. And that God was willing to sacrifice His only begotten Son so that that person could be saved. That one individual could be saved. And they have snubbed their nose at God. Why should any mercy, when that mercy has been extended to them, that grace of God has been extended to them, why should God have any mercy upon them at judgment? They have refused it, they've rejected it, they've thumbed their nose at God and His sacrifice, and then to say, oh, God's not just in punishing them. Yes, He is. They don't recognize the true heinous character of sin. And God will always be just in how He acts, even in the punishment of sin, and He will be glorified in such. The next time we'll start with verse 8 then, Lord willing.